The explosive collar detonates at 0347 hours with surgical precision. Penal Legionnaire 7749, Kappa drops to the trench floor. His suffering ended in less than 2 seconds. A blossom of red mist that the morning wind disperses across the firebase perimeter. The sound echoes sharp and final. 30 meters away, through reinforced rockcrete walls, a corpse starch processor tightens the straps of a respirator, grown brittle with age and chemical exposure. He is entering his 3rd year on the rendering floors. His cough has become a metronome, marking time until respiratory failure. He does not expect an ending that arrives all at once. This stark comparison reveals a disturbing truth about imperial justice. Certain civilian occupations inflict suffering so systematic and prolonged that military execution represents comparative mercy. The condemned receive quick deaths with the possibility of posthumous honor. The employed receive slow consumption disguised as honest labor. Both serve the Emperor's will, but only one maintains the dignity of meaningful sacrifice. To evaluate which fate proves worse requires clinical measurement. We establish 4 metrics that the Imperium itself implies through its paperwork and rights. Duration of suffering measures how long the system extracts utility from human resources before disposal. The average Penal Legionnaire survives 4.3 months in active combat zones, typically dying within minutes during firefights or seconds during disciplinary execution. Corpse starch processors average 18 months of progressive respiratory failure. Sump waste reclaimers endure 8 months of chemical poisoning before organ collapse. Bodily integrity forms our second measure. Penal Legionnaires maintain physical coherence until death. Their bodies serve as weapons platforms, requiring basic maintenance. Civilian workers experience systematic degradation, chemical burns, organ failure, neurological damage that transforms them into walking casualties long before death provides release. The Legionnaire dies intact. The worker dissolves incrementally. Spiritual dignity constitutes our 3rd criterion. Military service, even punitive service, carries the possibility of redemption through sacrifice. Combat chaplains offer battlefield blessings, and fallen soldiers receive memorial services acknowledging their imperial contribution. Civilian workers in hazardous occupations face spiritual contamination, their labor simultaneously essential and defiling, creating psychological torture that no piety can resolve. The possibility of redemption or meaningful death provides our final metric. Penal Legionnaires can earn commutation through exceptional service or achieve heroic death, serving recognizable military objectives. Civilian workers face systematic consumption with no possibility of advancement, recognition, or clean death. Their suffering serves purely economic functions, divorced from honor. On work assignments throughout, the Imperium appears a cryptic red stamp. Retention protocol authorized. This designation marks contracts for corpse starch facilities, sump waste reclamation sites, and servo skull harvesting operations. Workers sign without understanding the implications, discovering only after employment begins that normal resignation procedures do not apply. The protocol's mechanisms remain buried in administratum bureaucracy, but its effects prove unmistakable. Workers cannot leave, cannot retire, cannot escape through conventional legal channels. Administrative documents reference another revealing phrase: acceptable losses per shift. This terminology appears in production reports from facilities bearing retention protocols. Military units calculate acceptable losses against tactical objectives achieved. Civilian facilities calculate acceptable losses against production quotas met. The mathematics remain identical, but the context reveals how differently the Imperium values human resources across service categories. In underhive taverns and worker habitation blocks, a disturbing question circulates. Why do some laborers attempt to volunteer for penal battalions? Conventional wisdom suggests military punishment represents the ultimate deterrent, yet workers in certain occupations actively seek criminal conviction, hoping for military sentencing. These attempts rarely succeed. The administratum typically sentences such volunteers back to their original occupations with additional debt penalties. The workers understand something official doctrine obscures. Systematic consumption disguised as employment inflicts greater suffering than honest military punishment. Our investigation examines 3 categories where workers envy the condemned: corpse starch processing that transforms human remains into nutritional paste, sump waste reclamation, recovering materials from toxic underhive pools, and servo skull harvesting, preparing human skulls for cybernetic conversion. Each represents essential imperial industry. Each operates under retention protocols. Each consumes workers more thoroughly than military execution consumes condemned criminals. The Legionnaire's collar provided clean, death-serving military discipline. The worker's contract provides slow, death-serving economic necessity. Both serve the Emperor's will, but only one preserves the illusion that imperial justice contains mercy. The other reveals systematic human consumption refined into administrative procedure, where the only escape from suffering is becoming the product itself. The administratum's mortality ledgers record human consumption with the dispassionate precision of industrial accounting. These statistics strip away imperial rhetoric about service and sacrifice, revealing the calculated mathematics underlying human resource extraction. The numbers tell what the trenches and rendering floors already know. Death serves different masters, depending on the uniform worn or contract signed. Penal Legionnaires survive an average of 4.3 months in active combat zones, with quarterly attrition rates reaching 68% during intensive campaigns. Death arrives through enemy action, disciplinary execution, or explosive collar detonation. Yet within this grim calculus lies comparative mercy. 12% achieve commutation through exceptional service, their criminal records expunged and civilian status restored. Another 8% receive posthumous honors, their sacrifice acknowledged through memorial rites and family death benefits that provide material support rather than additional burden. Corpse starch processors present a different mortality profile entirely. Median survival extends to 18 months, but 95% develop terminal respiratory conditions within their first year of employment. Death comes through chemical pneumonia, organ failure, or systemic toxicity from prolonged exposure to rendering agents. The extended timeline reflects deliberate design. Workers remain productive longer than combat soldiers, extracting maximum utility before biological systems collapse. No subcategory exists for commutation or honor. Workers die anonymously, their bodies often processed through the same facilities where they labored. Sump waste reclaimers face compressed timelines that rival combat zones, without the possibility of tactical victory. Average survival reaches only 8 months, with 100% casualty rates within 2 years of initial employment. The toxic chemical soup of underhive sump pools inflicts systematic organ damage that proves universally fatal. Workers develop neurological disorders, skin lesions that never heal, and internal bleeding from chemical burns. Unlike combat casualties, these deaths serve no tactical objective beyond material recovery from poisonous depths. Servo-skull harvesters endure the most psychologically devastating profile. Median survival extends to 2.1 years, but 89% suffer complete psychological breakdown before physical death. The work of preparing human skulls for cybernetic conversion destroys mental stability through prolonged exposure to systematic dehumanization. Workers develop severe dissociative disorders, paranoid delusions, and catatonic episodes while remaining physically capable of continued labor. These patterns reveal what internal memoranda term graduated suffering, the Imperium's systematic approach to extracting maximum utility from human resources before disposal. Unlike military casualties that serve tactical necessities, civilian mortality serves purely economic functions. Working conditions are designed to consume workers at precisely calculated rates that optimize production output against replacement costs. Legal protections highlight the fundamental disparity. Penal legionnaires operate under military law, receiving standard combat rations, basic medical care, and access to battlefield chaplains. Their service carries defined duration with possibility of early termination through commutation or honorable death. Military casualties receive individual burial rights with personal identification markers and death benefits that support rather than burden surviving families. Civilian workers under retention protocols receive subsistence wages calculated to cover basic nutrition and company-provided housing. Medical care consists of workplace injury treatment that generates additional debt obligations. Company doctors prescribe medications sold through company stores at inflated prices, creating cascading financial obligations that compound faster than wages can service them. Workers who develop terminal conditions continue laboring until physical collapse, with medical debt transferring to surviving family members upon death. The retention protocol operates through debt bonding mechanisms that extend contracts beyond natural lifespans. Company housing, medical treatment, and equipment purchases create financial obligations that accumulate through administrative fees and interest calculations. Default provisions authorize reassignment to any function consistent with eventual debt recovery. A subparagraph titled Biological Limitation waives employer responsibility for providing duties compatible with the worker's remaining faculties. Posthumous reconciliation allows debt collection after death through seizure of effects and, where lawful, reclamation of tissues. Administrative efficiency reveals itself through personnel overlap. The same administratum clerks who process Penal Legion death benefits also stamp civilian contract extensions. Form L41 records fallen Penal Legionnaires and dispatches death benefits to listed beneficiaries. Form R97 extends laborer obligations by additional cycles and converts emergency medical treatment into compounding debt principle. Different ledgers, identical administrative machinery, revealing how the Imperium has refined human consumption into bureaucratic procedure. Consider the mathematics made flesh. A processor at Gamma 7 suffers chemical scalding that strips skin from his arms. He receives solves and debt adjustment for medical treatment. His output falls below quota. The deficit compounds. Retention triggers reassignment to sorting duties where protective equipment hides the burns, but bone dust accelerates lung damage. When he petitions for release, calculations determine his departure would imperil dependent allotments, extension approved. The contract survives longer than the worker's capacity to fulfill it, creating the central question that drives these industries. What happens when flesh fails, but legal obligations persist? What happens when flesh fails, but the contract remains valid becomes clear at Refectory Complex Gamma 7, where the answer is measured in tonnage and respiratory failure rather than mercy or release. The facility operates on 18-hour cycles, processing human remains into nutritional paste while simultaneously processing workers into future casualties. The death carts arrive at 0400 hours, their wheels grinding against rockcrete as servitors unload the night's harvest from Medici facilities, battlefield clearance operations, and underhive purges. Worker 7731 Mu begins his third year of employment by pulling on a respirator whose filters have been changed twice in 6 months. The H-12 model covers nose and mouth, but leaves eyes exposed to the bone dust that fills the air like industrial snow. He approaches the sorting conveyor, where decomposition determines routing. Grade A for fresh corpses requiring immediate processing. Grade B for swollen remains needing chemical pre-treatment. Grade C for desiccated bodies suitable for direct grinding, and Grade D for fragmentary remains that bypass most processing stages. Plague-flagged stock bears black skull glyphs and feeds separate incineration lines, but everything else feeds hunger. Manual sorting requires intimate contact with human remains. Workers lift bodies, examine decay stages, separate limbs from torsos for optimal processing efficiency. Flesh slides between fingers through protective gloves that company regulations require workers to purchase from facility stores. The work demands physical strength, psychological dissociation, and sustained focus while handling materials that were recently human beings with names and families, now reduced to production inputs measured against daily quotas. The simian pattern mandible dominates the grinding floor, its massive ceramite teeth reducing human skeletons to powder in 30-second cycles. The machine shudders when femurs enter, sending vibrations through the catwalk that workers feel in their bones. Calcium dust vents in pale clouds, despite ductwork designed to contain it, settling on eyelashes, lips, and the wet corners of eyes. Workers develop corpse lung within weeks, a dry cough first, then chalky sputum, then pain between ribs like wire tightening. The condition proves universally fatal within 18 months, but workers continue operating grinders until physical collapse prevents machinery operation. Production quotas demand 2.3 tons of processed biomass per worker per shift. For a crew of 80, this equals the nutritional requirements of a mid-level HAB district. The mathematics tolerate no variance. Workers who fall behind face penalty deductions from already insufficient wages. Those who maintain quotas avoid scrutiny that leads to reassignment to more hazardous duties. Voluntary overtime, unpaid extension to meet targets, keeps dependent ration allotments flowing when regular shifts prove insufficient. Company-issued respirators filter approximately 40% of airborne toxins and bone dust, a specification that appears deliberate rather than accidental. Military-grade equipment used by penal legionnaires in chemical warfare zones filters 95% of battlefield contaminants, demonstrating that superior protection exists but remains unavailable to civilian workers. Combat. Soldiers receive hazard pay for chemical exposure, medical monitoring for contamination symptoms, and equipment replacement schedules ensuring protective gear maintains effectiveness. Corpse starch workers receive subsistence wages, company medical debt for treating work-related injuries, and respirators designed to fail. Chemical rendering transforms soft tissues into nutritional paste through processes releasing toxic vapors that burn exposed skin and create respiratory damage through inhalation. Workers monitor massive vats where human flesh dissolves in acid baths, stirring mixtures with long paddles while reciting mandatory purity litanies. By your flesh we are sustained. By our labor you are rendered. The catechism provides rhythm rather than devotion, pacing words to knife movements and paddle strokes. The sweet sick smell of decomposition, mixed with chemical preservatives, penetrates every fiber, creating an invisible marker that brands workers as corpse handlers. The scent clings to clothing, skin, and hair with such persistence that industrial solvents cannot eliminate it. This olfactory signature makes workers untouchable in hab block social hierarchies. Children cross streets to avoid them. Vendors refuse their currency. Even desperate merchants turn away their coin, recognizing contamination that extends beyond physical presence into social death. The shift change ritual occurs at 2200 hours, when day crews emerge from processing floors. They move with the shuffling gait of advanced corpse lung, breathing labored and painful. Chemical burns mark exposed skin. Bone dust coats hair and clothing like grave soil. These processes resemble animated corpses more than living workers, their flesh slowly consumed by the same chemicals that dissolve the dead they handle. New workers arriving for night shift instinctively step aside, recognizing their future in these walking casualties, who continue reporting for duty, because retention protocol obligations provide no alternative. The distinction between input and labor force grows less meaningful with each shift, revealing why company safety measures offer such inadequate protection, and what mechanisms compel return to work that visibly consumes human life. The walking corpses emerging from processing floors return to company housing, not from choice, but from the mathematical impossibility of escape. Worker 7731-Mu shuffles toward Hab Unit 47-C, a converted shipping container stacked 12 high in the shadow of refectory complex Gamma-7. The retention protocol operates through cascading debt obligations that transform employment into economic bondage more absolute than any physical restraint, creating systematic traps that bind workers until their final breath and often beyond. Company housing forms the first link in this chain of necessity. The converted storage units occupy former freight containers welded into vertical stacks, each measuring 3 meters by 2 meters with a ceiling, height that requires permanent stooping. Monthly rent equals 60% of base wages, deducted automatically before workers receive their remaining pay. The units feature minimal amenities, a sleeping alcove, water reclamation unit, and air recycling system that reduces but cannot eliminate the chemical vapors that follow workers home. Workers cannot secure outside accommodation because the corpse stench marking makes them unwelcome in standard HAB blocks, while their remaining wages prove insufficient for independent housing costs. Refusal to accept company housing voids, employment contracts, and converts previous housing subsidies into immediate arrears under retention protocol, subclause, domicile continuity. Medical debt creates the second link through mandatory treatment for work-related injuries. The CR7 medical station operates between the bone mill and vat halls, a room of steel beds and sharp antiseptic scents where company Medicaid apply solvents, sutures, and respiratory stimulants. Treatment authorizations become debt instruments, with each bandage itemized, each antitoxin dose priced by milliliter, each consultation generating compound interest at rates printed in letters small enough to hide inside fingerprint whorls. Workers developing corpse lung must receive treatment to maintain productivity quotas, but each medical intervention generates debt that compounds faster than wages can service it. Decline treatment and face disciplinary assignment to the most caustic processing bays. Accept treatment and accumulate financial obligations that extend contract duration indefinitely. Dependent nutrition allowances complete the economic trap by transforming family members into leverage against worker departure. Spouses and children receive ration chits, providing basic nutrition supplements distributed through company stores at subsidized rates. These allowances often mean the difference between survival and starvation for worker families, but cease immediately upon employment termination, regardless of reason. Miss a week of work, and the chits deactivate. Attempt resignation and allowances to terminate instantly, with outstanding housing and medical debt migrating to family ledgers under continuation clauses. Workers cannot abandon employment that kills them, because departure would starve those they support, creating emotional leverage that supersedes economic calculation. The voluntary overtime system provides the final binding mechanism, though the terminology proves deliberately misleading. Base wages cover housing costs and basic worker nutrition alone. Dependent rations, medical treatment, and equipment replacement require additional income earned through unpaid extension shifts beyond the standard 18-hour cycle. Workers must formally petition for these extra duties, creating documentation that portrays extended chemical exposure as employee choice rather than employer coercion. The petitions bear catechismal phrases at the bottom: "Service beyond measure sanctifies the ledger." Decline voluntary shifts for a month, and the system triggers warnings that restrict clinic medication access and impose maintenance surcharges on housing costs. This economic architecture creates mathematical impossibility. Workers cannot afford to quit because dependent starvation exceeds personal death as unacceptable cost, cannot afford to stay because chemical exposure proves universally fatal within 18 months, cannot afford to die because debt obligations transfer to surviving family members under retention protocol provisions. Death provides no escape from financial bondage, merely redistributes burden to those least capable of bearing it. Military law governing penal legionnaires prohibits debt transfer to families, recognizing that extending punishment beyond the condemned violates imperial justice principles. Combat death nullifies all service-related obligations, allowing families to receive death benefits rather than inherited debt. Even disciplinary executions through explosive collar detonation provide clean endings that close accounts rather than extending them. Penal Legionnaires serve defined sentences with clear termination conditions, while civilian workers serve indefinite contracts with automatic extension clauses that activate upon financial default. Production accidents develop uncanny timing that suggests systematic rather than random occurrence. The simian pattern mandible experiences catastrophic gear failures when operated by workers within 6 months of debt forgiveness thresholds. Chemical vats develop seal failures during shifts staffed by employees whose medical obligations approach legal limits. Overhead rails that maintain perfect safety records for years begin shedding bolts over lanes worked by processors whose housing debt nears completion. When worker 59-2 Theta lost 3 fingers to a grinding wheel after 72 weeks of incident-free operation, his medical debt erased 2 years of financial progress in a single afternoon. The accident required reassignment to sorting duties where bone dust accelerated his respiratory decline while resetting his contract extension calculations to 0. Administrative efficiency reveals itself through integrated systems that manage both worker retention and corpse inventory using identical accounting procedures. The same cogitators that print cadaver tags for incoming remains also generate rent invoices and medical debt statements, drawing on linked files through shared identifiers. When workers die on shift, their identification badges become retrieval tokens scanned at facility gates, processing mills, and clinic terminals to simultaneously register corpse input weight and activate family debt migration protocols. The same clerks who process Penal Legion death benefits also stamp civilian contract extensions using identical administrative machinery to manage human resources whether living or dead. Worker 7731-Mu calculates these mathematics every time he signs a petition for additional shifts. He occupies housing his wages cannot unlock, breathes air his respirator cannot cleanse, and owes money that multiplies when he proves most diligent. The production accident waits in the jitter of conveyor motors, and the way supervisors' gazes linger on account balances approaching dangerous proximity to 0. He understands that the system requires him productive until he becomes pulp, and that the pulp will be carefully tallied against outstanding obligations that will migrate seamlessly to his family ledger, ensuring the arithmetic continues beyond his capacity to serve it. The arithmetic of debt bondage proves manageable compared to the spiritual calculus that corpse starch processing demands from human consciousness. Worker 7731. Mu no longer sees bodies when death carts arrive at 0400 hours. His mind has developed what facility medica term flesh blindness, the psychological adaptation that transforms human remains into raw materials, severing the cognitive connection between corpses and the people they once were. Hand finds limb, limb becomes weight, weight becomes throughput. This mental dissociation represents necessary survival, allowing workers to function without confronting the full horror of their daily tasks, yet exacting its own terrible price through systematic dehumanization. The ministorum requires daily confession sessions in the facility chapel, a cramped chamber wedged between the bone mills and chemical rendering bays, where condensation fogs the plastic viewing panes overlooking the production floor. Confessor Adjunct Hale leads these mandatory rituals with a voice trained to cut through machinery noise, demanding workers recite prescribed gratitudes for their sacred duty of recycling the Emperor's servants. The theological framework creates an inescapable paradox. Workers must acknowledge their labor as blessed imperial service, while simultaneously accepting spiritual contamination through contact with death. They express thankfulness for handling human remains, while accepting that this handling marks them as spiritually unclean, creating cognitive dissonance that fractures psychological stability over months of repetition. Children of corpse starch workers inherit spiritual contamination regardless of personal choice or devotion. Imperial schools refuse enrollment to offspring of corpse handlers, classifying them as spiritually contaminated despite their parents' essential service. These children receive rudimentary instruction in company facilities, where lessons focus on basic literacy and preparation for eventual employment in the same industries that consumed their parents. Educational segregation creates hereditary castes, where contamination passes through bloodlines, ensuring the labor cycle perpetuates itself through generations marked as untouchable. The psychological toll manifests through recurring nightmares reported by 89% of facility workers. These dreams follow identical patterns. Workers find themselves on processing conveyor belts, fully conscious but unable to move as they approach grinding machinery or chemical vats. They experience the sorting process from the perspective of corpses, feeling hands examining their decomposition stage and routing them toward appropriate processing stations. The dreams continue through grinding and rendering with vivid sensory detail that persists after waking, tasting chemical preservatives, feeling bones crack under mandible teeth, watching flesh dissolve while maintaining awareness throughout transformation. Penal Legionnaires receive battlefield chaplains who offer combat blessings and spiritual guidance that preserves human dignity even in punishment. Military chaplains provide confession that absolves rather than contaminates, offering redemption through martial sacrifice that transforms criminal sentences into honored service. Even disciplinary execution maintains spiritual dignity through quick death that prevents prolonged dehumanization. Combat death carries meaning beyond tactical necessity, allowing condemned criminals to achieve posthumous honor, serving the Emperor's military objectives. The facility chapel reveals the twisted spirituality that corpse starch processing demands. Prayers rise over rendering vats where human flesh dissolves in chemical baths, creating liturgical accompaniment to systematic dehumanization. Workers light votive candles made from processed human fat, the flames casting shadows across walls stained with bone dust. The altar bears aquila patterns crafted from worker finger bones, and ceremonial vessels fashioned from rib cages that once housed beating hearts. Confessor Adjunct Hale conducts services that acknowledge the sacred nature of corpse starch work while demanding acceptance of spiritual contamination, explaining that workers sacrifice personal purity to serve imperial nutritional requirements. This theological framework transforms contamination into sacrifice. Workers accept spiritual death to provide physical life. Their damnation, purchasing salvation for those who consume their labor's products. The system requires their defilement to function, making redemption impossible without destroying the service itself. The same rubric that names the work sacred duty also brands workers spiritually contaminated, creating paradox enforced through litanies and ration chits. The sweet-sick smell of decomposition mixed with chemical preservatives penetrates every fibre, creating an olfactory signature that brands workers as corpse handlers in hab-block social hierarchies. This scent cannot be washed away with industrial solvents, marking families as untouchable and teaching children their predetermined place in imperial society through the simple act of breathing near their parents. When surface employment proves unbearable through spiritual contamination, economic bondage, and systematic dehumanization, some workers seek alternatives in the depths below. Beneath the refectories and habstacks, the sump levels spread in oil-dark sheets where different forms of suffering offer escape from theological paradox through honest, physical horror that makes no claims to sacred purpose. When corporate-sponsored spiritual contamination becomes unbearable, when the theological paradox of sacred defilement fractures psychological stability beyond repair, some workers seek a different form of suffering in the depths below. The underhive sump pools offer honest physical horror that makes no claims to sacred purpose, vast poisonous lakes where toxic waste from upper levels collects in chemical stratification that burns flesh without demanding gratitude for the privilege. The sump levels sprawl beneath imperial hives like underground seas, fed by constant drainage from manufactorums, medical facilities, and processing plants that serve the Imperium's industrial appetite. Pool 7 Alpha receives runoff from promethium refineries, creating orange slicks that ignite when disturbed by diving operations. Pool 12 Gamma collects medici waste, including surgical chemicals and biological matter, producing viscous green mixtures that dissolve organic materials on contact. Pool 4 Delta accumulates heavy metals from munitions production, creating dark waters that cause neurological damage through skin absorption within minutes of exposure. Reclamation teams descend, wearing improvised diving gear assembled from salvaged components, and black market purchases that represent desperate improvisation rather than engineered protection. Worker 441-Kappa adjusts the seals on a dry suit patched from 3 different predecessors, its rubber gone tacky from years of caustic exposure. His rebreather consists of a converted mine respirator with home-machined filter cages filled with charcoal canisters refilled from burnt sumpwood and promethium ash. Weighted boots fashioned from scavenged ship ballast provide stability in dense chemical solutions, but often fail catastrophically when corrosive agents eat through sole materials or buckles corrode under chemical assault. A typical dive lasts 4 to 6 hours in absolute darkness, where lamps fail rapidly as chemical vapors etch glass lenses into blindness and dissolve luminous pigments from housing materials. Workers navigate by touch through liquid that burns exposed skin within minutes, following systematic search patterns with one hand on braided wire tethers and the other sweeping half-moon arcs ahead of shuffling feet. The sump floor consists of silty deposits that swallow boots to the ankle, while concealing valuable materials dense enough to justify recovery costs through human consumption. The objective involves salvaging rare metals that drop through the hive like toxic rain, osmiridium dust from tool lathes, adamantine filings, copper buzzbars from scrapped transformer. Assemblies intact, cogitators reach the bottom, wrapped in preservative slime. Their data stacks worth more than annual wages to black market tech adepts. Occasionally, workers discover archaeotech fragments that sustain the Lucky Strike mythology, motivating continued participation despite universal casualty rates. These stories circulate through underhive taverns with religious fervor. Worker 229. Sigma allegedly discovered technology worth enough to purchase clean employment for his extended family, though verification proves impossible and examples remain conveniently absent. Competition for productive sites creates territorial violence that adds human predation to environmental hazards. Gang bosses control access to the richest pools through force and economic leverage, extracting tribute from independent teams while maintaining exclusive diving rights for their own operations. Sabotage proves common, cutting airlines during competitor dives, contaminating equipment stores with additional corrosives, or spreading false information about archaeotech discoveries to lure rivals into the most toxic zones. Equipment theft occurs regularly since replacement costs exceed monthly earnings, forcing victims to dive with increasingly inadequate protection or abandon the profession entirely. Chemical exposure creates systematic organ failure, progressing through predictable stages that workers recite like liturgical responses. Initial symptoms include skin lesions that never heal properly, developing into weeping sores that resist medical treatment while providing entry points for secondary infections. Neurological damage manifests through tremors, memory loss, and coordination difficulties, particularly dangerous when operating underwater in complete darkness. Respiratory failure follows as chemical vapors dissolve lung tissue, despite rebreather protection that filters only 40% of airborne toxins. Final stages involve organ shutdown, as accumulated poisons overwhelm biological systems designed for environments containing breathable air rather than industrial waste. Penal Legionnaires operating in chemical warfare zones receive military-grade environmental suits with redundant filtration systems and regular equipment inspection schedules ensuring protective integrity. Combat medics monitor exposure levels and rotate personnel before toxic accumulation reaches dangerous thresholds, while immediate decontamination procedures include antitoxin treatments and medical evacuation for personnel showing contamination symptoms. Even condemned criminals receive protection standards that prioritize mission completion over maximum resource extraction from human assets. The materials recovered from sump pools feed imperial industrial requirements through economic calculations that justify extreme human costs. Rare earth elements retrieved from toxic depths supply munitions production lines, equipping Imperial Guard regiments. Salvaged cogitators provide components for orbital defense platforms, protecting hive worlds from external threats. The strategic value created through these recoveries exceeds individual human life in administratum cost-benefit analyses that measure acceptable losses per shift against material throughput rather than human dignity. Gang territories complicate survival through additional layers of violence and economic exploitation, transforming environmental hazards into systematic predation that reveals how competition for scarce resources multiplies suffering beyond what toxic exposure alone inflicts, creating the underground economy that determines who survives long enough to discover what hidden treasures justify such calculated human consumption. Gang territories and systematic exploitation transform environmental hazards into economic predation that multiplies suffering beyond what toxic exposure alone could inflict. The sump pools operate as a stratified economic landscape, where survival depends not merely on avoiding chemical death, but navigating brutal hierarchies that extract tribute from desperation itself. Boss Grex controls access to Pool 7 Alpha through enforcers armed with shock mauls and chemical sprayers, demanding 40% tribute from independent teams while maintaining exclusive diving rights for his own operations. This protection racket disguises systematic theft as territorial security. Teams that refuse payment face equipment sabotage, severed airlines during dives, or elimination through staged accidents in toxic depths where witnesses dissolve along with evidence. Equipment purchases create immediate financial bondage through company store monopolies that transform necessary safety gear into debt instruments. A patched, dry suit assembled from 3 deceased predecessors costs 3 months' wages, despite failing seals that guarantee chemical exposure. Rebreather filters require weekly replacement at costs equivalent to family food budgets, forcing workers to choose between adequate protection and dependent nutrition. Worker 441-Kappa calculates these mathematics while adjusting corroded buckles on weighted boots purchased through installment plans that compound interest faster than diving profits can service them. Each piece of gear becomes a financial noose tightening with every shift, ensuring workers remain perpetually indebted to systems designed to consume them systematically. Black market medical treatments devour most remaining earnings through desperate attempts to extend working life against inevitable chemical poisoning. Antitoxin injections cost 50 thrones per dose, providing temporary organ damage relief, while creating dependency requiring increasingly frequent treatments. Unlicensed medici operating from damp tunnels offer recycled organs harvested from the recently drowned, lungs that function 6 months, kidney grafts processing toxins 8 weeks, liver segments metabolizing poisons until rejection sets in. Pain suppressants provide the only relief from chemical burns that never heal, but tolerance develops rapidly while prices reflect desperation rather than therapeutic value. These treatments offer no cure, merely brief reprieves that barely extend working life before bodies succumb to systematic consumption. Deep teams represent the ultimate expression of calculated human sacrifice disguised as economic opportunity. These specialized crews venture into the most hazardous sump levels, where toxic concentrations prove immediately fatal, but archaeotech discoveries justify extreme human costs through mathematical equations measuring family survival against individual destruction. Deep team contracts specify death benefits equal to 5 years' standard wages, paid to surviving dependents upon confirmation of worker mortality. The arithmetic proves grimly attractive. Certain death within weeks provides better family support than prolonged survival, generating subsistence income insufficient for dependent nutrition. Workers mark themselves with reagent burns as insurance seals, ensuring bodies found with proper identification earn contracted payouts. Death pools reveal surface society's intersection with underhive suffering through betting markets where upper-level dwellers wager on worker survival times like spectator sport. Bookmakers operating in mid-hive establishments accept stakes on individual divers, team performance, and accident probabilities, with odds calculated from historical mortality data and current toxic concentrations. Popular bets include survival duration for new workers, probability of equipment failure during specific dives, and whether teams discover valuable archaeotech before succumbing to chemical exposure. These markets treat human suffering as entertainment while generating profits that never reach workers whose deaths provide the spectacle, reducing lives to gambling commodities tracked on chalkboards and cogitator slates. The retention protocol extends its reach through equipment debt inheritance that forces occupational succession across generations. When worker 441-Kappa succumbs to organ failure after 14 months of operations, his improvised gear becomes inherited liability, transferred to surviving family. His son receives notification of equipment debt totaling 8 months' wages, along with employment authorization for sump pool operations, transforming grief into economic necessity. The system perpetuates itself through financial mechanisms, ensuring worker replacement occurs through family obligation rather than voluntary enlistment, creating intergenerational cycles where children inherit both equipment and the suffering required to service inherited debt. Penal Legionnaires receive standardized equipment maintained through military supply chains, prioritizing functional protection over profit extraction. Environmental suits undergo regular inspection with mandatory replacement when protective integrity falls below operational standards. Military medical care includes immediate decontamination, antitoxin treatments, and evacuation protocols, prioritizing personnel survival over mission completion. Death benefits support families through monetary payments and continued medical coverage rather than debt transfer, perpetuating suffering across generations. The recovery process demonstrates how human consumption serves imperial requirements through systematic resource extraction. Valuable materials flow upward, rare earth elements becoming munitions components, salvaged cogitators providing processing power for defense installations, archaeotech fragments supporting technological advancement programs. Worker mortality flows downward into statistical abstractions, where individual deaths become data points measuring acceptable losses per shift against material throughput. The intersection of dangerous operations with structural failures creates catastrophic potential, where environmental hazards combine with facility deterioration, revealing true priorities when systems must choose between material preservation and human rescue. The intersection of dangerous operations with structural failures occurs at 0917 hours, when Worker 441, Kappa's deep team, operates a pneumatic drill through muscle memory, his vision clouded by chemical cataracts developed over 18 months of toxic exposure. The drill bit penetrates corroded rockcrete and strikes a pressure pocket that has accumulated toxic gases for decades beneath Pool 7's foundation, centuries of trapped solvents and refinery gas compressed by hive weight and industrial negligence. The facility's predictive cogitator flagged drilling anomalies 3 cycles ago, but production quotas override safety protocols as consistently as acceptable losses per shift calculations override human welfare. The pressure release sounds like a scream, amplified through metal, followed by silence that lasts 3 heartbeats before catastrophe begins. Toxic gases erupt from the puncture with volcanic force, creating a geyser of poisonous vapor that rises through 40 meters of chemical soup to break the surface in a mushroom cloud of yellow-green death. The gases prove heavier than air, rolling across Pool 7's surface in waves that ignite spontaneously when they contact electrical systems powering diving equipment. Chemical fires spread across the pool's surface like liquid lightning, fed by decades of accumulated petroleum byproducts and industrial solvents that transform the water into burning soup. Worker 441-Kappa finds himself trapped 60 meters below as rising poison transforms the worksite into a pressurized death chamber. His improvised rebreather fails immediately as caustic gases overwhelm filtration systems designed to filter 40% of normal toxins, not concentrated eruptions that exceed measurement scales. Toxic liquid burns through his patched dry suit at 17 separate points, while his teammates attempt emergency ascent, discovering their tether lines dissolving in the chemical eruption. The team's emergency beacon transmits location data for 47 seconds before electronics fail, their final signal indicating depth and toxicity readings that transform rescue into recovery operation. Surface workers flee through collapsing tunnels as the facility's containment systems fail in cascade failure, revealing decades of deferred maintenance, prioritizing profit over protection. Emergency bulkheads designed to isolate contaminated sections refuse to seal because mechanisms have corroded from constant chemical exposure. Ventilation systems reverse flow, pulling toxic gases into worker habitation areas instead of venting them safely, creating underground rivers of poison that dissolve support beams and undermine structural integrity throughout the complex. Boss Grex abandons territorial claims within minutes, leading enforcers through escape routes reserved for leadership, while leaving subordinate workers to navigate flooding tunnels without guidance. His retreat demonstrates gang protection's true nature: profit extraction from desperation rather than genuine security when catastrophic failure threatens everyone equally. Equipment stockpiles remain locked in storage chambers, filling with toxic gas, but personal survival exceeds material assets, representing months of tribute collection from desperate workers. The breach creates chain reactions, contaminating the entire complex as toxic floods pour through interconnected drainage systems into adjacent pools. Pool 12 Gamma receives burning chemicals that react violently with existing biological waste, creating secondary explosions, rupturing containment barriers. Pool 4 Delta's heavy metal contamination combines with incoming toxins, producing compounds that eat through ceramite piping, allowing poisonous mixtures to reach groundwater systems, serving entire underhive districts. The facility transforms from controlled industrial site into spreading chemical disaster, threatening thousands beyond the immediate workforce. Emergency response protocols reveal institutional priorities through resource allocation, prioritizing material recovery over human rescue. Facility supervisors coordinate salvage operations while workers drown in chemical soup, dispatching recovery teams to secure valuable equipment rather than attempt personnel evacuation. Salvage cranes swing toward water lines through camera feeds smeared with toxic vapor, their operators working blind to extract crates of rare metals while severing lifelines that might impede equipment recovery. Administrative voices on communication channels specify that personnel rescue remains subordinate to equipment preservation, which remains subordinate to production continuity. Adeptus Mechanicus recovery teams arrive within 6 hours, wearing sealed environmental suits, providing complete protection against chemical exposure unavailable to civilian workers. These tech adepts methodically catalogue archaeotech discoveries, while stepping over worker corpses dissolved beyond recognition, servo skulls recording material specifications, and recovery priorities with mechanical precision. Their sealed suits filter 100% of airborne toxins, while mission parameters focus exclusively on technological recovery rather than human assistance, demonstrating that adequate protective technology exists, but remains restricted to operations serving imperial rather than commercial interests. The disaster statistics reveal institutional priorities through cold numerical analysis that transforms human catastrophe into administrative efficiency metrics. 847 workers die through drowning, chemical poisoning, or structural collapse during the 12-hour crisis period. Recovery operations salvage 12.3 tons of rare metals, including osmiridium, adamantine fragments, and archaeotech components valued at 40 million thrones. The facility returns to operational status within 6 weeks using replacement workers recruited through emergency conscription from debtor populations and underhive surplus labor pools that provide inexhaustible human resources for systematic consumption. Administrative reports classify the incident as a resource optimization event, bureaucratic terminology that transforms mass casualty disaster into acceptable business disruption. The classification enables insurance claims, tax adjustments, and regulatory exemptions while avoiding terminology suggesting institutional responsibility for preventable deaths. This linguistic transformation demonstrates how imperial bureaucracy converts human suffering into administrative convenience through careful word selection that obscures rather than illuminates actual events. Military disaster protocols provide stark contrast through immediate medical evacuation, prioritizing personnel recovery over equipment preservation. Combat units receive rescue operations, where medics risk valuable gear attempting casualty recovery, while fallen soldiers receive individual burial rights, with personal identification and death benefits supporting families, rather than burdening them with inherited obligations. Even penal legionnaires receive casualty collection points guarded from marauders, chaplains recording last words, and memorial services acknowledging sacrifice rather than statistical absorption into production metrics. The Sump-7 breach demonstrates systematic human expendability through emergency response treating workers as acceptable losses while preserving materials and maintaining production schedules. The facility's rapid operational recovery using replacement workers reveals industrial systems designed to consume human resources as efficiently as they process toxic materials, raising critical questions about how the Imperium replaces nearly 1,000 specialized workers so rapidly, and what other essential services operate under similar expendability calculations that prioritize resource extraction over human survival in the Emperor's vast industrial machinery. The intersection of dangerous operations with structural failures erupts into catastrophic reality at 0917 hours when Worker 441, Kappa's pneumatic drill, penetrates corroded rockcrete and strikes a pressure pocket containing decades of accumulated toxic gases. The eruption sounds like industrial thunder amplified through metal conduits, followed by 3 heartbeats of silence before catastrophe transforms Pool 7 into a cauldron of poisonous fire. Toxic gases blast upward through 40 meters of chemical soup with volcanic force, creating a mushroom cloud of yellow-green death that rolls across the facility's surface in waves heavier than air, igniting spontaneously when they contact electrical systems powering diving equipment. Worker 441-Kappa finds himself trapped 60 meters below as rising poison transforms his worksite into a pressurized death chamber. His improvised rebreather fails immediately, overwhelmed by caustic concentrations that exceed all measurement scales. Chemical burns eat through his patched dry suit at 17 points, while teammates attempt emergency ascent, discovering their tether lines dissolving in the toxic eruption. The team's emergency beacon transmits location data for 47 seconds before electronics fail, the final signal indicating depth and toxicity readings that transform rescue operations into statistical abstractions measuring acceptable losses per shift. Surface workers flee through collapsing tunnels as the facility's containment systems fail in cascade sequences, revealing decades of deferred maintenance, prioritizing profit margins over protective infrastructure. Emergency bulkheads designed to isolate contaminated sections refuse to seal because mechanisms have corroded from constant chemical exposure, never addressed through preventive maintenance protocols. Ventilation systems reverse flow under pressure differentials, pulling toxic gases into worker habitation areas instead of venting them safely, creating underground rivers of poison that dissolve support beams and undermine structural integrity throughout the complex. Boss Grex abandons territorial claims within minutes, leading enforcers through escape routes reserved for leadership, while leaving subordinate workers to navigate flooding tunnels without guidance or assistance. His retreat demonstrates gang protection's true nature as profit extraction from desperation rather than genuine security when catastrophic failure threatens everyone equally. Equipment stockpiles remain locked in storage chambers, filling with toxic gas, but personal survival exceeds material assets, representing months of tribute collection from desperate workers whose protection contracts prove worthless during actual emergency. The breach creates chain reactions, contaminating the entire complex as toxic floods pour through interconnected drainage systems into adjacent pools, never designed to handle such concentrated chemical loads. Pool 12 Gamma receives burning chemicals that react violently with existing biological waste, creating secondary explosions, rupturing containment barriers, and spreading contamination beyond original impact zones. Pool 4 Delta's heavy metal deposits combine with incoming toxins, producing compounds that eat through ceramite piping, allowing poisonous mixtures to reach groundwater systems serving entire underhive districts, with contamination that will persist for generations. Emergency response protocols reveal institutional priorities through resource allocation decisions, prioritizing material recovery over human rescue operations. Facility supervisors coordinate salvage operations, while workers drown in chemical soup, dispatching recovery teams to secure valuable equipment rather than attempt personnel evacuation from accessible areas. Salvage cranes swing toward designated recovery points through camera feeds obscured by toxic vapor, their operators working through remote systems to extract crates of rare metals while severing lifelines that might impede equipment recovery operations. Administrative voices on communication channels specify explicit priorities. Personnel rescue remains subordinate to equipment preservation, which remains subordinate to production continuity requirements. Adeptus Mechanicus recovery teams arrive within 6 hours, wearing sealed environmental suits, providing complete protection against chemical exposure unavailable to civilian workers despite identical technological requirements. These tech adepts methodically catalogue archaeotech discoveries while stepping over worker corpses dissolved beyond recognition, servo skulls recording material specifications and recovery priorities with mechanical precision unaffected by human suffering. Their sealed suits filter 100% of airborne toxins, while mission parameters focus exclusively on technological recovery rather than human assistance, demonstrating that adequate protective technology exists but remains restricted to operations serving Imperial rather than commercial interests. The disaster statistics reveal institutional priorities through cold numerical analysis, transforming human catastrophe into administrative efficiency metrics. 847 workers die through drowning, chemical poisoning, or structural collapse during the 12-hour crisis period. Recovery operations salvage 12.3 tons of rare metals, including osmiridium, adamantine fragments, and archaeotech components valued at 40 million thrones, according to Administratum assessment protocols. The facility returns to operational status within 6 weeks using replacement workers recruited through emergency conscription from debtor populations and underhive surplus labor pools, providing inexhaustible human resources for systematic consumption. Administrative reports classify the incident as a resource optimization event, bureaucratic terminology, transforming mass casualty disaster into acceptable business disruption, enabling insurance claims, tax adjustments, and regulatory exemptions, while avoiding language suggesting institutional responsibility for preventable deaths. This linguistic transformation demonstrates how imperial bureaucracy converts human suffering into administrative convenience through careful word selection, obscuring rather than illuminating actual events and their systematic causation. Military disaster protocols provide stark contrast through immediate medical evacuation, prioritizing personnel recovery over equipment preservation during combat emergencies. Combat units receive rescue operations where medics risk valuable gear attempting casualty recovery, while fallen soldiers receive individual burial rights with personal identification and death benefits, supporting families rather than burdening them with inherited obligations. Even penal legionnaires receive casualty collection points guarded from marauders, chaplains recording last words, and memorial services acknowledging sacrifice rather than statistical absorption into production metrics. The SUMP-7 breach demonstrates systematic human expendability through emergency response treating workers as acceptable losses while preserving materials and maintaining production schedules above human welfare considerations. The facility's rapid operational recovery using replacement workers reveals industrial systems designed to consume human resources as efficiently as they process toxic materials, raising critical questions about how the Imperium replaces nearly 1,000 specialized workers so rapidly, and what other essential services operate under similar expendability calculations, prioritizing resource extraction over human survival in the Emperor's vast industrial machinery. The rapid replacement of nearly 1,000 specialized workers after the SUMP-7 breach reveals the Imperium's systematic approach to human resource management across all essential industries. The same administrative efficiency that processed 847 casualties into statistical abstractions also routes replacement consignments to facilities requiring different forms of specialized labor. Some shipments contain rare metals recovered from toxic depths. Others contain human heads destined for cybernetic conversion. The ledgers treat both as raw materials requiring processing, but the charnel facilities where skulls become servo-skulls demand workers sanctify their own psychological destruction while performing tasks that systematically dehumanize both processor and processed. Charnel Facility Sanctum Primus operates through intake schedules coordinated with battlefield clearance operations, Arbeits execution yards, and volunteer donation programs that provide steady streams of human cranial material. Worker 223-Theta begins his shift at 0600 hours by donning ceremonial robes over protective gear, the ritual garments marking his dual status as sacred servant and spiritually contaminated laborer. The delivery bay receives battlefield casualties bearing regimental identification tags, executed criminals with purity attestations from Arbeits facilities, and volunteer donors whose circumstances remain obscured through administrative euphemisms like final utility oath and posthumous service commitment. Cranial extraction requires surgical precision, combined with industrial efficiency, workers wielding bone saws etched with the litany of separation, while reciting prescribed prayers over each processed skull. The ritual begins with dermal flensing that removes identifying features, followed by precise cranial cuts that preserve bone integrity while accessing brain tissue. Brain extraction proves the most psychologically devastating task, requiring workers to remove thinking organs from skulls while acknowledging these materials once housed consciousness, memory, and human personality. The extracted brains undergo immediate analysis for neural complexity before disposal, their former capacity for thought reduced to technical specifications measuring cybernetic compatibility. The work combines physical horror with spiritual weight through mandatory liturgical accompaniment that transforms systematic dehumanization into sacred duty. Workers recite the litany of sacred severance during brain removal. From flesh to service, from thought to function, from mortality to eternal duty. These prayers provide rhythm for mechanical motions while creating cognitive dissonance between sacred purpose and visceral horror. Each skull represents a future servo-skull serving imperial administration, making the labor technically sacred despite requiring intimate handling of human remains that simultaneously sanctifies and defiles. Cranial cleaning involves chemical baths monitored with precision that determines final skull quality grades. Workers immerse processed skulls in enzymatic solutions that dissolve remaining tissue while preserving bone density and structural integrity required for cybernetic implantation. The process removes all traces of individual identity, leaving anonymous bone shells ready for technological resurrection through servo-skull conversion. Acid concentrations and immersion times require expertise developed through handling thousands of human heads, workers becoming specialists in transforming former persons into standardized components. Bone density testing determines structural suitability for cybernetic implants through resonance analysis and compression measurements. Workers use calipers and sonic analyzers to evaluate thickness, calcium content, and fracture resistance that dictate eventual servo skull assignments. Skulls failing density requirements face rejection despite perfect neural pathway mapping, their former owners deemed unsuitable for eternal service through posthumous inadequacy. These failures undergo grinding for bone meal used in agricultural supplements, ensuring even rejected materials serve imperial nutritional requirements. Neural pathway mapping represents the facility's most sophisticated operation, requiring workers to analyze brain cavity dimensions and neural connection points suitable for cybernetic integration. Microprobes trace residual electrical patterns, while cogitator interfaces map optimal implant placement for various servo skull functions. This process demands intimate knowledge of human neuroanatomy, combined with mechanical engineering principles, creating expertise that proves simultaneously valuable and spiritually contaminating. The quality grading system classifies skulls through composite scoring, measuring intelligence ratings, spiritual purity assessments, and cybernetic compatibility that determine eventual servo skull assignments and worker compensation. Grade alpha specimens with superior cognitive capacity and perfect purity ratings become servo skulls serving senior imperial officials, their enhanced capabilities justifying premium processing costs. Grade beta skulls serve mid-level administrators and minor nobility, while grade gamma specimens handle routine bureaucratic duties. Failed grades face disposal through grinding operations that reduce human heads to industrial additives. Processing bonuses create perverse economic incentives, rewarding workers for identifying superior specimens, their expertise in evaluating human intelligence, generating additional income through systematic assessment of cognitive capacity in corpses. Workers develop disturbing enthusiasm for discovering high-grade skulls, celebrating intellectual achievement while destroying its physical manifestation through preparation for cybernetic conversion. Monthly performance reviews measure accuracy in grading predictions against final servo skull functionality assessments. The psychological toll proves inevitable, despite spiritual frameworks justifying the work. 89% of workers develop severe dissociative disorders within 6 months, their minds fragmenting under constant exposure to systematic dehumanization disguised as sacred service. These disorders manifest through flesh blindness that transforms human remains into raw materials, workers losing ability to distinguish between processed skulls and living colleagues. Some begin addressing corpses as if conscious while treating living humans as unprocessed materials awaiting preparation. The facility's chapel overlooks the processing floor through reinforced plastic windows, providing constant visual reminder of sacred purpose underlying disturbing work. Workers attend mandatory services where prayers rise over bone-cleaning vats and neural mapping stations, creating liturgical accompaniment to systematic dehumanization. The altar bears servo skull prototypes, displaying successful conversions, mechanical devices that once housed human consciousness, now serving imperial administrative functions through technological resurrection. Votive candles made from processed human fat cast shadows across walls, decorated with cranial fragments, arranged in aquila patterns. Penal Legion chaplains provide stark contrast through spiritual comfort that preserves rather than destroys human dignity during punishment. Military chaplains offer confession that absolves sin without demanding psychological sacrifice, battlefield blessings that honor rather than consume human consciousness, and memorial services acknowledging fallen soldiers as individuals rather than raw materials. Even condemned criminals receive spiritual guidance, maintaining their humanity through final moments rather than systematic dehumanization disguised as sacred duty. Volunteer donors complicate the theological framework through conscious participation in their own posthumous processing. Some represent zealots seeking final certainty of imperial service. Others include workers whose accumulated debt or terminal conditions make posthumous utility payments attractive to surviving families. These donors sign final utility oaths before lying on intake slabs, their voluntary participation creating additional spiritual complexity for workers who must process willing participants alongside battlefield casualties and executed criminals. The theological paradox underlying skull harvesting creates fundamental questions about how the Imperium reconciles sacred service with spiritual contamination, transforming essential imperial labor into systematic destruction of worker psychology, while demanding gratitude for the privilege of serving through spiritual defilement. The volunteer donors who complicate skull harvesting's theological framework through conscious participation in their own posthumous processing reveal deeper mechanisms of control operating beyond economic bondage. Worker 223-Theta enters his 14th month processing human skulls while trapped within contradictory spiritual frameworks that simultaneously sanctify and condemn identical labor. His dissociative episodes now occur hourly. Tremors affect his precision work. Yet he continues reporting for shifts, because the spiritual contamination marking his family creates pressure exceeding economic coercion through systematic exclusion from normal imperial society. The contradictory spiritual framework operates through theological paradox, deliberately designed to fracture mental stability while preventing escape. Workers perform sacred duty preparing materials for imperial service, yet are treated as spiritually contaminated pariahs whose essential function requires their permanent defilement. This proves systematic rather than accidental, utilizing spiritual contamination as control mechanism, supplementing economic bondage through religious obligation extending beyond individual workers to encompass entire family units across generations. Each shift begins with mandatory purification rituals, acknowledging spiritual contamination while providing no genuine cleansing, transforming necessary hygiene into psychological torture through theological impossibility. Workers undergo ritual ablutions in tiled chambers reeking of incense and chemical solvents, scrubbing hands with abrasive compounds until skin brightens raw while reciting litanies, acknowledging their spiritual defilement through contact with human remains. The purification chambers feature lye baths that scour flesh, censers flooding lungs with incense thick as industrial fog, and electroflagellation frames offered for voluntary penance that administrative pressure renders compulsory through performance evaluations, measuring spiritual dedication against productivity metrics. Purity officers conduct hourly contamination assessments using sanctified Auspex devices, measuring spiritual toxicity through biological samples and psychological responses. Workers provide cheek swabs, palm prints, and robe fibers for analysis seeking corruption markers, receiving no clear definition, but generating numerical contamination scores affecting rations and housing assignments. High miasma counts trigger additional penances and docked wages, creating economic punishment for spiritual contamination, proving unavoidable through continued employment. The mathematical precision applied to unmeasurable spiritual concepts demonstrates administrative efficiency, converting theological doctrine into bureaucratic control mechanisms. Mandatory confession sessions occur in facility chapels, where confessor militant Cain demands workers express gratitude for spiritual contamination, while seeking absolution for contamination. Tomorrow's shift will renew through identical tasks. These sessions follow rigid formulae, creating psychological torture through repetition. Workers admit spiritual defilement through handling human remains, express thankfulness for sacred service despite contamination, and request forgiveness for sins that continued employment makes inevitable. The confessions provide no actual absolution, merely administrative requirements, disguised as spiritual guidance, reinforcing psychological bondage through repetitive acknowledgement of inescapable corruption. The Ministorum classifies skull harvesting as blessed service essential to imperial function, while forbidding workers from entering most imperial buildings or participating in normal religious ceremonies. Workers wear crimson armbands bearing skull and cog symbols, signaling restricted entry to public shrines, community halls, and standard refectories. The great nave of Basilica Imperialis permits their presence only during designated hours, through separate aisles under supervision of ushers, ringing handbells, warning devout citizens that sacred contamination approaches. Their wages purchase candles and tithes, but their bodies cannot cross thresholds without constant reminders that sanctity belongs to others. Families inherit spiritual contamination through bloodline marking systems, extending individual worker defilement across generations, regardless of personal choice or devotion. Children of skull harvesters face exclusion from roller progenium programs, craft guild apprenticeships, and standard imperial education, their futures predetermined by parental occupation rather than individual aptitude. Housing assignments restrict families to specialized districts adjacent to processing facilities, where contamination levels remain acceptable for tainted bloodlines. Parish registers list children as spiritually contaminated, despite parental service classified as sacred duty by identical theological authorities, creating hereditary castes where spiritual taint transfers through bureaucratic efficiency, transforming individual service into permanent caste designation. Workers developing severe dissociative disorders or psychological collapse receive ceremonial recognition through graduation ceremonies, euphemistically framing mental destruction as spiritual promotion. These monthly rituals occur in facility chapels, with mandatory attendance for remaining workers who witness colleagues receiving final blessing, acknowledging readiness for ultimate service as skull donors themselves. The process includes hymns celebrating spiritual achievement, readings acknowledging final utility, and individual blessings, where graduates receive communion before transitioning from processor to processed material serving identical production requirements. The facility chapel overlooks processing floors through reinforced plastic windows, providing constant visual reminder of sacred purpose underlying disturbing work. Workers light votive candles rendered from processed human fat, while knowing They may soon provide materials for future candles, creating devotional environment, acknowledging personal expendability through symbolic acts. The altar displays servo-skull prototypes, demonstrating successful conversions alongside memorial plaques, honoring graduated workers, transforming spiritual space into showcase for systematic dehumanization, disguised as technological resurrection. Penal Legionnaires receive battlefield chaplains, providing genuine spiritual guidance, preserving human dignity during punishment, rather than systematic psychological destruction disguised as sacred service. Combat chaplains offer confession that absolves sin without demanding spiritual contamination, battlefield blessings honoring rather than defiling participants, and memorial services acknowledging fallen soldiers as individuals rather than raw materials for processing. The retention protocol operates through spiritual bondage, supplementing economic control by transforming contamination into leverage, preventing worker departure. Families already marked as tainted bloodlines face additional stigmatization if primary workers abandon sacred service, creating spiritual pressure exceeding economic coercion through social ostracism affecting entire family units. Workers cannot escape employment that spiritually contaminates them, because departure would intensify family marking, while eliminating income, supporting dependents bearing inherited contamination, revealing how the graduation ceremony transforms psychological breakdown into final spiritual achievement, serving administrative efficiency rather than human dignity. The spiritual bondage preventing Worker 223-. Theta's departure through family contamination leads inevitably to the retention protocol's final application as systematic consumption disguised as spiritual elevation. His psychological breakdown has progressed beyond facility tolerance thresholds. Dissociative episodes occur hourly. Tremors affect precision work requiring steady hands, and productivity metrics have fallen below acceptable parameters for 18 consecutive shifts. The graduation ceremony approaching represents not workplace accident, but administrative inevitability, transforming processor into processed material through bureaucratic ritual, presenting systematic consumption as theological achievement. The veiling notice arrives at dawn shift change, delivered by courier servitor whose Vox unit repeats prescribed blessings, while stamping each page with crimson wax bearing facility seals. Retention protocol citation appears beneath liturgical text in smaller print. Reassignment to donor tier authorized due to cumulative contamination, tremor onset, and diminished throughput metrics. Consent remains implied through prior employment oaths signed during recruitment, while debt reconciliation proceeds through sanctification bonus payments, offsetting outstanding obligations through posthumous utility calculations. The same cogitators that calculated his shift output now assign him donor grade, pending neural pathway compatibility assessments. Preparation unfolds through established protocols designed for administrative efficiency rather than human dignity. Purity officers conduct cranial measurements beneath ceremonial veiling, while company medicae record bone density assessments, determining suitability for cybernetic conversion. Worker 223-Theta signs Form S-17, acknowledging transfer from processor status to processed material classification, then places his thumb to sanctified ink pads, providing biometric confirmation for systems treating his consciousness as inventory awaiting conversion. The ceremony occurs in facility chapels overlooking processing floors through reinforced plastic viewing panels, where co-workers file in, wearing robes streaked with chemical stains. Confessor Militant Caney reads prescribed homilies, describing how the Emperor redeems diminished flesh through machine-spirit union, transforming individual death into technological resurrection, serving Imperial administrative requirements. Sedatives dull resistance while preserving reflexes needed for optimal cranial positioning during extraction procedures conducted with identical precision. Worker 223-Theta applied to countless previous subjects. Bone saws etched with prayer lines follow suture patterns. With metronomic precision, he taught to apprentices who now observe his processing. Chemical baths dissolve remaining tissue while preserving structural integrity required for cybernetic implantation. His skull rendered anonymous through processing techniques he perfected over 14 months. The processed skull receives brass identification tags, marking it as harvested from faithful service, bearing special purity seals denoting exceptional spiritual merit and processing priority during servo-skull conversion. Facility records demonstrate that 78% of workers at Sanctum Primus eventually graduate to donor status, their processed skulls bearing these special purity seals. These statistics represent design goals rather than unfortunate outcomes. Personnel charts in administrative offices display desired throughput for donors by quarterly periods, aligned with servo-skull requisitions from administratum subsectors requiring specialized components. Training rosters map directly onto projected attrition curves, ensuring replacement worker availability matches graduation schedules through systematic recruitment and consumption cycles. Administrative efficiency achieves systematic elegance through training programs, where workers prepare their own replacements while approaching graduation thresholds. The mentor who trained worker 223. Theta's hands for precise cranial cutting has spent months instructing his replacement in identical procedures that will eventually be performed upon the instructor himself. Apprentices shadow senior workers through exact techniques they will later apply to their teachers, creating self-perpetuating cycles, preserving institutional knowledge through systematic consumption of knowledge, bearers who become practical examples demonstrating proper technique to successors following identical paths. Families receive sanctification bonuses equivalent to 3 months of deceased worker wages, credited through company script systems rather than imperial currency. These payments offset dependent nutrition costs, while failing to eliminate accumulated medical debt or housing arrears, migrating to surviving family members under retention protocol provisions. Brass certificates bearing serial numbers rather than names provide memorial documentation suitable for company housing display, acknowledging service through numerical identification and matching processed skull inventory systems. This systematic consumption contrasts sharply with Penal Legion mortality, where soldiers die, serving recognizable tactical objectives with possibility of posthumous honor. Combat death provides meaning through battlefield achievement while closing legal obligations rather than extending them across generations. Military casualties receive individual burial rights, memorial services acknowledging sacrifice, and death benefits supporting rather than burdening families with inherited debt requiring continued service in contaminating industries. Skull harvesters die as components rather than individuals, their utility perfected through bureaucratic silence rather than tactical achievement. No objectives are seized, no battlefield memorials gather final words. Homilies substitute for honor, purity seals replace funeral markers, and administrative ledgers absorb persons while returning mechanical components programmed with familiar voices that may dictate future shift assignments to replacement workers trained through identical techniques. The graduation process reveals the retention protocol's true nature as systematic human consumption rather than debt bondage mechanisms. Workers do not accumulate financial obligations requiring extended service. They follow predetermined paths from recruitment through processing to final transformation into raw materials serving identical production requirements. Debt represents administrative framework rather than underlying purpose, which involves converting human resources into technological components through systematic consumption, disguised as spiritual elevation and economic necessity, revealing how this systematic consumption model applies across other imperial industries and what this demonstrates about the Imperium's fundamental attitude toward human resources as infinitely replaceable inputs in production processes designed to consume workers as efficiently as they process materials. The graduation process, revealing systematic consumption rather than accidental attrition, leads directly to the ledgers where human fate becomes a scheduling problem and morality transforms into accounting convention. The cogitators tracking ore throughput also calculate labor attrition curves, projecting intake periods, peak utility phases, and conversion to raw material with actuarial precision. When Worker 223. Theta's graduation ceremony concludes with brass identification tags replacing human identity. The same administrative systems immediately update replacement requisitions and training schedules, demonstrating that individual death represents planned obsolescence rather than workplace tragedy. Statistical analysis strips away administrative euphemisms and spiritual justifications to reveal mathematical precision underlying human resource management across all hazardous imperial industries. These mortality profiles demonstrate systematic design, optimizing utility extraction against replacement costs through calculated consumption rates that transform individual suffering into predictable data points measuring acceptable losses per shift against material throughput requirements. Penal Legionnaires establish our baseline for institutional cruelty, with median survival of 4.3 months in active combat zones and quarterly attrition rates reaching 68% during intensive campaigns. Yet within this grim calculus lies comparative mercy. 32% achieve commutation through exceptional service or heroic death, providing posthumous honor and family death benefits. Military law provides defined sentences with clear termination conditions, legal appeal processes, and explicit prohibition against debt transfer to surviving family members. Even disciplinary executions through explosive collar detonation provide clean endings that close obligations rather than extending them across generations. Corpse starch processors present systematically extended mortality profiles, with median survival reaching 18 months, while 95% develop terminal respiratory conditions within their first employment year. The extended timeline reflects deliberate design, maximizing utility extraction before biological systems collapse under chemical exposure that preserves productive function while ensuring eventual death through predictable medical conditions. Workers remain productive significantly longer than combat soldiers through systematic poisoning that maintains output quotas until respiratory failure provides the only escape from economic bondage. No subcategory exists for commutation or honor. Workers die anonymously, with their bodies often processed through identical facilities where they labored. Sump waste reclaimers face compressed timelines rivaling combat zones, without possibility of tactical victory or meaningful sacrifice. Average survival reaches only 8 months with 100% casualty rates within 2 years of initial employment. The toxic chemical environment inflicts systematic organ damage, proving universally fatal, while serving purely economic functions, recovering materials from poisonous depths. These deaths serve no tactical objective beyond resource extraction, transforming human life into expendable tools for material recovery operations that generate profits flowing upward, while mortality statistics flow downward into forgotten administrative abstractions. Servo-skull harvesters endure the most psychologically devastating profiles, with median survival extending to 2.1 years, but 78% experiencing systematic consumption through graduation ceremonies, transforming workers into processing materials. The work destroys mental stability through prolonged exposure to systematic dehumanization, while maintaining physical capability for continued labor, until psychological breakdown triggers transition from processor to processed material serving identical production requirements. Their processed skulls receive special purity seals denoting faithful service, while bearing brass tags rather than names, completing transformation from individual consciousness to standardized component. The economic logic underlying these mortality patterns reveals what internal memoranda term graduated suffering, systematic approaches extracting maximum utility from human resources through precisely calculated consumption, optimizing production output against replacement costs. Unlike military casualties serving tactical necessities, civilian mortality serves purely economic functions through working conditions designed to consume workers at mathematically determined rates. The system tolerates no variance. Optimal extraction requires specific time frames, balancing training investments, productivity periods, and disposal efficiency to maximize return on human capital investment. A respirator providing genuine protection costs more than training replacement workers. Environmental suits matching tech-adept specifications would eliminate profit margins entirely. Penal units receive superior equipment because decisive battles demand intact soldiers, while industry prefers predictable loss to unpredictable expense. The calculus demonstrates that systematic consumption proves more economical than systematic protection when human resources remain infinitely replaceable through targeted recruitment from populations engineered for scarcity. Legal protections highlight fundamental disparities between military and civilian human resource management that reinforce systematic consumption through administrative efficiency. Penal legionnaires operate under military law, providing standardized equipment, basic medical care, and access to battlefield chaplains, maintaining human dignity during punishment. Their service carries defined duration with possibility of early termination through commutation or honorable death serving recognizable tactical objectives. Military casualties receive individual burial rights with personal identification markers and death benefits, supporting rather than burdening surviving families through financial assistance rather than inherited debt obligations. Civilian workers under retention protocols receive subsistence wages calculated to cover basic nutrition and company-provided housing, while generating cascading debt obligations through medical treatment, equipment purchases, and dependent nutrition allowances. Commercial contracts contain indefinite extension clauses activating upon financial default, with no legal recourse for workers seeking termination. Company medical care generates additional debt rather than providing treatment, while posthumous reconciliation allows debt collection after death through seizure of effects and tissue reclamation where administratively feasible. The legal framework ensures human assets continue generating economic value even after consumption, through debt transfer perpetuating family obligations across generations. Recruitment for systematic consumption deliberately targets populations lacking alternatives through artificial scarcity creation, ensuring participation in hazardous occupations disguised as voluntary employment. Underhive dwellers face housing restrictions, food rationing, and employment barriers, preventing access to safer occupations while maintaining eligibility for hazardous industrial positions. Debtor families inherit financial obligations requiring immediate income generation through available positions concentrated in consumption industries. Social outcasts marked through spiritual contamination, criminal records, or bloodline taint find conventional employment opportunities, eliminated through systematic exclusion from guild work, imperial service, and educational advancement. The Imperium creates artificial scarcity by restricting access to Penal Legion opportunities for populations most likely to volunteer for military punishment as escape from civilian consumption. Recruitment officers reject volunteers from hazardous civilian occupations, classifying them as too valuable for military service, while sentencing criminals from safer occupations to penal battalions. This systematic selection ensures hazardous civilian positions maintain adequate workforce levels through populations denied access to comparative mercy, available through military punishment. Administrative efficiency reveals itself through personnel systems, managing both recruitment and disposal, using identical bureaucratic machinery, processing Penal Legion death benefits, and civilian replacement shipments through linked databases tracking population, demographics, debt obligations, and employment eligibility. The retention protocol operates as inventory management for human resources rather than worker protection, utilizing mathematical models predicting optimal consumption rates across different industrial sectors. The same cogitators managing material inventory also calculate human resource degradation through medical monitoring, psychological assessments, and productivity metrics triggering reassignment to more hazardous duties or graduation ceremonies when optimal extraction periods conclude. Administrative systems track worker utility curves with the same precision, applied to equipment maintenance schedules, ensuring systematic replacement flows, match disposal requirements through recruitment pipelines, providing inexhaustible human resources for industries designed to transform workers into raw materials. This mathematical precision demonstrates administrative sophistication, treating human life as infinitely replaceable input in industrial processes optimized for maximum resource extraction rather than human welfare. Mortality statistics align with production quotas. Graduation schedules coordinate with replacement shipments, and debt obligations transfer across generations, ensuring perpetual workforce availability. The system requires no external coercion because artificial scarcity eliminates alternatives, while systematic consumption provides the only available escape through transformation into raw materials, serving identical production requirements that originally consumed the workers who created them. The statistical analysis reveals fundamental questions about why the Imperium requires these specific forms of systematic human consumption rather than conventional industrial processes that preserve rather than consume human resources, and how workers themselves understand and respond to their expendable status within systems designed to consume them as efficiently as they process materials in the Emperor's vast industrial machinery, optimized for systematic transformation of human consciousness into technological components serving imperial administrative requirements. The mathematical precision underlying systematic consumption transforms into human choice. At the moment, workers understand their expendability with brutal clarity, yet continue reporting for shifts that will consume them. The statistical abstractions measuring acceptable losses per shift become personal calculations where individuals weigh slow death with family support against quick death with family destitution. These testimonies reveal that apparent voluntary participation represents rational decision-making within systems designed to eliminate genuine alternatives while preserving the administrative fiction of choice through bureaucratic procedures that channel populations toward systematic consumption. Worker 7731. Mu attempted to volunteer for penal battalion service after his third chemical hemorrhage left him coughing blood during shift changes at Refectory Complex Gamma 7. His petition cited willingness to serve the Emperor through military punishment rather than continued civilian employment, requesting assignment to any combat unit regardless of criminal status. The administratum rejection arrived within 48 hours, bearing Personnel Optimization Division seals. Civilian worker classified as too valuable for military reassignment due to specialized training investments and facility requirements. The form noted that voluntary military service remained available through standard recruitment channels, requiring clean health certifications and family consent documentation that his accumulated medical debt and dependent obligations rendered impossible to obtain. Sump Waste Reclaimer 891-Gamma committed deliberate theft of Imperial cogitator components, worth enough to warrant serious criminal prosecution, expecting Arbite's intervention, leading to Penal Legion assignment, rather than continued diving operations, causing progressive neurological damage. He calculated that military punishment would provide cleaner death-serving, recognizable objectives, while eliminating family debt obligations through combat casualty benefits. Instead, company security handled the incident through internal debt adjustment procedures, adding equipment replacement costs to existing obligations, while reassigning him to deeper, more toxic pool sections as disciplinary measure. His criminal act became administrative matter, processed through commercial rather than military justice systems, demonstrating how the Imperium routes populations away from comparative mercy available through military punishment. Servo Skull, Harvester 223-. Theta filed formal complaints with local Arbeits citing unsafe working conditions and systematic psychological abuse, hoping for legal intervention, providing escape through protective custody or criminal prosecution. The investigation concluded that working conditions met imperial industrial standards, while spiritual contamination represented voluntary acceptance through employment contracts rather than imposed punishment. His complaint generated frivolous litigation fines, extending retention protocol obligations, while marking him for enhanced monitoring during graduation eligibility assessments, transforming attempts at legal escape into additional bondage mechanisms. These systematic rejections reveal deliberate policy maintaining labor pools through restricted access to cleaner deaths, while creating economic conditions that eliminate choice. Recruitment officers receive explicit instructions classifying workers from hazardous civilian occupations as essential industrial assets unsuitable for military service, ensuring adequate workforce levels for consumption industries requiring steady human resource inputs. The administratum actively prevents individuals with high utility scores in corpse starch processing, sump waste reclamation, or servo skull harvesting from military transfer regardless of criminal records or desperate petitions, treating their bodies as pre-allocated resources too valuable for single decisive expenditure through combat death. Workers calculate survival mathematics with precision that strips away illusions about voluntary employment, while acknowledging material constraints that make systematic consumption economically rational, despite psychological horror. Corpse starch processor wages generate 18 months of dependent nutrition allowances and housing subsidies before terminal respiratory failure, while Penal Legion death benefits provide lump sum payments insufficient for long-term family support without continued income streams. Sump waste reclamation offers 8 months of hazard pay, premiums exceeding standard wages, allowing families to accumulate resources before worker death eliminates future earnings. Servo skull harvesting provides 2.1 years of steady income, plus graduation, bonuses equivalent to 3 months' wages, creating financial incentives that make systematic consumption economically superior to military punishment, despite extended suffering duration. The ultimate horror manifests through workers actively sabotaging their own performance, hoping for graduation rather than continued suffering, revealing calculations where becoming raw material represents hope rather than punishment. Worker 223-. Theta deliberately exposed himself to additional chemical contamination and psychological stress, hoping to accelerate qualification for donor status, providing immediate family bonuses rather than prolonged spiritual contamination. His statement proves chilling in its rational desperation. The dreams will stop, the voices will quiet. I will serve without this constant ache. Corpse starch processors request reassignment to more hazardous duties, hoping to accelerate respiratory failure while maintaining dependent allowances through posthumous benefits. Sump waste reclaimers volunteer for deep team assignments, accepting certain death within weeks rather than months of gradual organ failure through standard diving operations. These testimonies reveal psychological frameworks where workers preserve agency through choosing consumption methods rather than accepting random industrial accidents or prolonged deterioration. The system provides multiple paths toward identical outcomes while maintaining illusions of choice that preserve psychological stability through perceived control over inevitable fate. Workers demonstrate rational decision-making within irrational systems, optimizing family welfare through personal sacrifice calculated against available alternatives that prove uniformly fatal through different time frames and payment structures. The institutional contradiction underlying these calculations demonstrates that the Imperium treats condemned criminals better than law-abiding citizens in hazardous occupations, because military efficiency requires better treatment than industrial efficiency. Combat effectiveness demands equipment maintenance, medical support, and morale preservation incompatible with systematic consumption models optimizing resource extraction over personnel welfare. Military units require soldiers capable of tactical decision-making and equipment operation, while industrial operations require workers capable of repetitive tasks until consumption completion through predictable degradation schedules. Penal Legionnaires receive superior equipment, medical care, and legal protections because battlefield effectiveness requires functional personnel rather than systematic degradation. Industrial workers receive minimal protection because production efficiency benefits from predictable replacement cycles, eliminating training investments while maintaining steady output through workforce turnover. The disparity reveals fundamental differences between military and industrial human resource management, where combat requirements preserve human capability, while production requirements consume human resources through systematic extraction, optimized for maximum utility before disposal. Worker testimonies demonstrate understanding of these calculations through statements revealing psychological adaptation to systematic consumption disguised as voluntary employment. They speak of graduation ceremonies as achievement rather than punishment, describe chemical poisoning as occupational hazard rather than systematic murder, and frame debt obligations as family support rather than intergenerational bondage. This linguistic adaptation preserves psychological stability while acknowledging material reality. The choice exists only in selecting consumption methods rather than avoiding consumption entirely. The volunteers' calculations reveal systematic consumption as imperial governance philosophy, prioritizing resource extraction over human welfare through administrative efficiency, transforming individual death into productive utility serving broader economic requirements. These testimonies support the documentary's central thesis by demonstrating that certain imperial occupations inflict sufferings so systematic and prolonged that condemned criminals receive comparative mercy through quick, meaningful death rather than systematic consumption disguised as employment. The arithmetic proves inescapable. When becoming raw material represents rational hope, the system has achieved perfect efficiency in converting human consciousness into administrative convenience through mathematical precision that treats individual life as infinitely replaceable input in production processes designed to consume workers as thoroughly as they process materials in the Emperor's vast industrial machinery. The volunteers' calculations revealing systematic consumption as rational choice within engineered scarcity return us to the stark comparison that launched this investigation. At 03:47 hours, the explosive collar detonates with surgical precision. Penal Legionnaire 7749, Kappa drops to the trench floor. His suffering ended in less than 2 seconds. A blossom of red mist that the morning wind disperses across the fire base perimeter. The sound echoes sharp and final. 30 meters away, through reinforced rockcrete walls, Worker 7731. Mu tightens the straps of a respirator whose filters have been changed twice in 6 months. He enters his 3rd year on the rendering floors, knowing his cough has become a countdown to respiratory failure. He expects no ending that arrives all at once. The evidence proves inescapable. Comparative suffering is not a flaw in the imperial system. It is the system. The Imperium's worst civilian occupations inflict suffering so systematic and prolonged that condemned criminals receive mercy through execution rather than employment. Corpse starch processors endure 18 months of terminal respiratory failure while handling remains that may include their own future. Sump waste reclaimers survive 8 months of organ failure, diving through toxic soup that will eventually dissolve their corpses. Servo skull harvesters endure 2.1 years of psychological destruction before graduation ceremonies transform them into the materials they processed. These occupations exist not despite imperial efficiency, but because of it, serving multiple functions beyond simple resource extraction. They provide population control by consuming surplus underhive dwellers, debtor families, and social outcasts who might otherwise require expensive management. They maintain fear, ensuring compliance across other sectors, where workers understand that worse fates await those challenging established hierarchies. Most crucially, they demonstrate the Imperium's approach to human resources as infinitely replaceable inputs in industrial processes, optimized for maximum extraction rather than human welfare. The retention protocol operates across all hazardous industries as inventory management for human assets, utilizing debt bondage, spiritual contamination, and artificial scarcity to ensure steady workforce flows into consumption industries. The same administrative machinery processes Penal Legion death benefits and civilian replacement requisitions, treating both condemned criminals and law-abiding workers as raw materials requiring different processing schedules, but identical bureaucratic efficiency. From worker testimonies emerges a procedural creed distilled from systematic suffering. Count your shifts, not your years. Time becomes currency measured in production cycles rather than life expectancy. Bribe for clean filters when possible. Small corruptions purchase brief extensions against inevitable consumption. Never volunteer for deep assignments. Enthusiasm accelerates transformation into raw material. When the retention protocol activates, remember your name until the end. Preserve individual identity against systematic dehumanization, designed to ease psychological transition from person to product. If given the choice between graduation and continuation, choose quickly. Prolonged decision-making increases suffering without changing outcomes. These rules acknowledge systematic consumption while preserving agency through tactical choices within strategic inevitability. Workers maintain psychological stability by optimizing their path toward becoming raw materials rather than pursuing impossible escape from systems designed to eliminate alternatives through economic necessity and administrative precision. The morning shift begins with sounds that have provided rhythm throughout this investigation. The stamp of forms being processed, transforms human resources into statistical abstractions. The scratch of quills recording casualties measures acceptable losses per shift against material throughput. The whispered prayers of workers who understand they are simultaneously servants and raw materials in the Emperor's vast consuming engine provide spiritual comfort, acknowledging, rather than denying, their expendable status. In processing facilities across the Imperium, workers light votive candles made from processed human fat, while knowing they may soon provide materials for future candles. They train replacement workers in techniques that will be applied to their own bodies when systematic consumption completes its cycle. The system achieves perfect efficiency by making human resources self-perpetuating through consumption that preserves institutional knowledge by consuming knowledge-bearers. The final image holds on worker 7731-Mu's identification tag, brass stamped with numbers rather than his birth name, designed to outlast its bearer while serving administrative convenience. The tag bears facility seals, employment codes, and debt-tracking numbers that will migrate to family ledgers upon his death. It represents imperial efficiency, converting individual identity into bureaucratic abstraction through systematic dehumanization, refined into standard procedure. The explosive collar provides mercy through decisive action. The employment contract provides systematic consumption through administrative precision. Both serve imperial requirements, but only one acknowledges what it destroys. The other transforms human suffering into economic utility, while preserving the fiction of voluntary participation in the Emperor's infinite appetite for human resources, converted into raw materials, serving the same production requirements that originally consumed the consciousness that created them.